Think about the last time you fell asleep. You might remember getting comfortable, closing your eyes, maybe turning over a few times because apparently no sleeping position stays comfortable for more than 30 seconds. You might even remember your last clear thought, and then nothing. At some point, you fell asleep. You know it happened because eventually you woke up. But the transition itself is missing. That's strange because falling asleep is something you experience thousands of times. Yet you can't seem to remember the moment it actually happens. Try to catch it deliberately and you run into an even stranger problem. As long as you're consciously checking whether you're asleep, you're still awake enough to check. Then eventually that monitoring disappears. And by the time you wake up, there's no memory saying, "That was the moment." It can feel as though consciousness simply switched off and left a blank space behind. But that creates an important distinction. The last thing you remember before sleep is not necessarily the moment you fell asleep. It's only the last thing your brain successfully preserved. Those sound like the same thing. They're not. Because to remember the instant you fell asleep, two things would need to cooperate. You would need enough awareness to experience the transition clearly, and your brain would need to turn that experience into a memory you could retrieve the next morning. During sleep onset, both are changing, and that means the missing moment may not be a memory that was recorded and then lost. The real problem begins earlier than that. The first problem is that falling asleep isn't really a single event. We tend to imagine consciousness like a light. You're awake, something changes, and suddenly you're asleep. But sleep onset is a transition. As you drift towards sleep, different features of wakefulness begin changing on different timelines. Your attention becomes less stable. Your responses to the outside world become less reliable. Thoughts can become fragmented or strange. Brain activity begins shifting toward patterns associated with sleep, and those changes don't all happen at exactly the same instant. This creates a surprisingly practical problem for scientists. What counts as the moment someone falls asleep depends partly on what you're measuring. A sleep recording can identify physiological signs that someone has entered sleep. A person asked about their own experience may place that boundary somewhere else. People can sometimes be classified as asleep while still reporting that they felt awake. So there isn't necessarily one sharp internal border where a fully conscious mind suddenly becomes an unconscious one. Wakefulness becomes less stable until enough of the system has changed that we call the resulting state sleep, which means the moment you're trying to remember may not exist in the form you imagined. But that still leaves something unexplained. Even if falling asleep is gradual, experiences are still happening near that boundary. So, why don't more of them survive until morning? Being conscious of something and remembering it later are not the same process. An experience can happen without becoming a durable memory. That's true even while you're fully awake. A conversation can pass through your awareness and disappear minutes later. Near sleep, that gap becomes much more important. As sleep onset progresses, the brain becomes less reliable at encoding new experiences into memories that survive. So you may still have thoughts, you may notice sounds in the room, images can appear behind closed eyes. Fragments of experience can continue even as your connection to the outside world weakens. But experiencing those things doesn't guarantee that you'll remember them in the morning. This helps explain something peculiar about the edge of sleep. Your subjective experience doesn't necessarily stop at the same point that your reliable memory of it does. The record can become incomplete before experience itself disappears. So, when you wake up and search backward through your memories, you eventually reach a final retrievable moment. Everything after it feels like nothing. But that blank doesn't prove nothing was happening. It means whatever happened next failed to leave a memory strong enough for your waking brain to recover. And this creates the deeper problem. Even if some part of you could notice yourself drifting into sleep, noticing it wouldn't be enough. That observation would still have to survive the transition. This is where trying to catch yourself falling asleep runs into a fundamental problem. To observe the transition, you need to keep monitoring your own state. Am I still awake? Did something just change? But that monitoring is itself part of wakefulness. As sleep develops, your attention becomes less stable, and your responsiveness to the outside world declines. Your ability to form lasting memories is becoming less reliable at the same time. There isn't a separate observer inside your brain that remains fully alert while everything else shuts down. The observer is changing too. That creates an unusual limit on introspection. You can notice yourself getting sleepy. You can notice your thoughts becoming less controlled, or the outside world becoming less important. But maintaining the kind of deliberate attention needed to identify the exact transition also helps keep you on the waking side of it. Eventually, that monitoring stops. And if an experience occurs close enough to sleep onset, it faces the second problem. It still has to be encoded strongly enough to survive until you wake. So, the closer you get to the boundary you're trying to observe, the less reliable the tools you're using to observe it become. You don't stand outside the transition and watch consciousness disappear. You're part of the system, disappearing into it. By morning, all you have is the surviving record. You can trace your memories backward. Maybe a thought, a sound, the feeling of turning over. Then the record ends. It's tempting to treat that endpoint as the moment you fell asleep. But it isn't a reliable timestamp. It's the last experience that made it through. Sleep itself may have developed after that memory, while awareness became less stable and new experiences became less likely to be preserved. The boundary you remember and the physiological boundary researchers measure don't have to line up perfectly. So, the original mystery changes. You aren't repeatedly experiencing one perfectly defined instant of falling asleep and somehow forgetting it afterward. Sleep arrives as a transition, and during that transition, the very things you'd need to capture it, stable awareness, sustained attention, and reliable memory formation, are changing too. By the next morning, your waking mind reconstructs the night from whatever survived. There is a last memory, then a gap. And somewhere inside that gap, without a clean observer left to mark the crossing, you became asleep.